Hey internets, so today I would like to talk about the topic of woke bigotry. Now while this is just a quick rant, it's actually going to be one of my more important videos, because out of all the things I would wish that everyone would universally understand, this is one where if everyone on the planet immediately got it, the world would be heading in a much better direction than it is now. And what I'm talking about is the fact that woke scolds don't actually believe that bigotry is bad. In fact, they're very much okay with racism, and actively support policies that favor it. Yeah, that's right, for all of the rhetoric that these DEI supporters tend to put out that they are against racism and that they want to end racism, the reality is they actually don't. And when they say that they're against racism, they're actually pulling a very big equivocation, where they are treading back and forth between their own definition of racism and a colloquial definition of racism, which allows them to play a very cheap mind game where they can pretend like they're against racial discrimination when in fact they are very much in favor of doing so, and it is in fact the praxis of DEI when pushed to its logical conclusions. To show you what I mean, I'll just go over a quick clip right here from Representative Ayanna Pressley.
I am so tired of white men failing up. This lack of accountability is a shameful, inadequate, and deeply unsatisfactory, and it is re-traumatizing. Chair Grunberg.
So yeah, now the obvious thing that most people will probably notice here is that if this was a white woman saying this about any other race, the leftists would have absolutely lost their minds. That's at least the on-the-surface obvious thing to spot, just the obvious hypocrisy. But there's actually a lot more to it than just that. Due to how disparate impact works, the praxis of diversity, equity, inclusion, how it's actually enacted, is just collective guilt, which is then being used to justify aggressively enforced racial, gender, and other forms of discrimination with the full blessing of the state. So long as the condition is met that the bigotry that the woke scolds are in favor of is only targeting those to be deemed as members of more successful groups, regardless of whether or not they themselves as an individual are successful. And there's some pretty big logical and ethical problems with this, because the basic idea that it is presenting is that it's okay to seek justice against Bob and violate Bob's property rights in order to make up for an alleged crime by Steve, simply because Bob and Steve share some kind of collectivist identity, even if Bob and Steve have no idea who each other are, and completely regardless of Bob's consent or any kind of participation in what Steve did. Now, when you point this out to a leftist, they will usually obfuscate and accuse you of making a straw man argument against their collectivist ideology by playing the definition game. For instance, they'll say something like racism equals prejudice plus power. That's probably the most common one, which is of course a collectivist definition. It only makes any kind of sense if you assume all power is collectivized. The reasoning kind of makes sense if you think about it on an individual level. For instance, imagine an extremely authoritarian country with a peasant who is falsely accused of a crime going up against an all-powerful judge. And we'll just say that the peasant and the judge are two different races. Now, the peasant in this situation, if they try to say anything racist at all, they would immediately be found guilty and they have no power or recourse. Whereas the judge in this situation can say whatever they want, shouting out any slur that they want, and the peasant would have no recourse. In fact, an all-powerful judge in an authoritarian dictatorship can just point him out and say, you're guilty, based purely on racial prejudice. And there's really nothing that the peasant in this scenario would be able to do. So to some degree, prejudice plus power makes a little bit of sense. The problem, of course, is that it only makes sense in the context of the moment. Woke DEI ideologues are presenting this as a full, generalized definition, where power is a fully collectivized construct that everyone of a collective equally shares, which is completely insane and very incorrect. It's actually something known as a fallacy of reification. They're treating the collective as if it's a real objective thing and ignoring the actual amount of power that each individual has, which results in them having to make brain-dead takes, such as twisting themselves in an insane level of rocket-powered mental gymnastics where they're trying to tell you that Oprah Winfrey cannot possibly be racist against a white homeless guy, because prejudice plus power. It's a very stupid redefinition, and the fact that it actually gets any kind of consideration in academia at all is probably one of the biggest pieces of evidence that academia has been infiltrated by leftist woke ideologues. Because honestly, even a child can dissect it by just thinking about it logically for a few minutes. And yet many social scientists at prestigious universities unironically present this claptrap as true. And now the equivocation, of course, comes in because most people consider the definition of racism to simply be collectivized racial guilt. For instance, if you go back even just as early as Oxford 3rd edition in 2010, common definition of racism, the one that most people will use today, and what most people think about, is this one: a person who shows or feels discrimination or prejudice against people of other races, or who believes that a particular race is superior to another, or showing or feeling discrimination or prejudice against people of other races. In other words, the whole spiel about prejudice plus power is largely irrelevant. It's just a way for them to obfuscate what they actually believe, which is that if you don't accept Marxism or other forms of leftist authoritarian economic policy, along with state intervention to enforce their collectivist inequality ideas, if you don't agree with them on that, then well, you're just a bad person. In other words, what they've done here is they've concocted this fraudulent narrative that racism and collective inequality are the same thing. But of course, that's nonsensical because you can't actually have collective equality, unless you have individual equality, which doesn't exist. Because again, the logical conclusion of intersectionality is that intersectional groups can be multiplied without any kind of limit. You can always invent a new collective group between any number of people. And so the logical conclusion is that this will never actually be achieved unless you have total individual equality. Which of course, based on how DEI works, is equality of outcome. Despite the fact that inequalities of outcomes do not actually prove discrimination. When far-left ideologues talk about being against racism, what they're really saying is that they're against inequality. And they are perfectly happy with doing or saying bigoted things, so long as their bigotry inches them closer to their ridiculous pie-in-the-sky Marxist utopia. And it's very important for people to remember this whenever you see a woke scold complain about racism or accuse someone of being bigoted or accuse them of being a racist. They are equivocating between a colloquial and their own bogus definition of racism. Two definitions which actually contradict each other, because the colloquial one views collective guilt as bad, whereas the woke prejudice plus power definition views collective guilt as a good thing. This is why everything the wokes have done in the last 10 years have made bigotry worse, and it's why Ayanna Pressley can get away with saying blatantly anti-white male rhetoric, and no one on the far left will call her out for it, because wokes are in fact very much in favor of bigotry, so long as it serves their agenda. Anyways, that's all. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, you can like, subscribe, and all that. And if you really liked it, you can support my content by donating to me on Ko-Fi or Subscribe Star, or buying some merch. Till next time.